So, hi, Mark. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for being here. Even though it's a virtual format that we have with you and for this interview and your participation on this panel. But we're delighted to have you here and in name of Coparmex Aguascalientes and Coparmex León, which are the Chamber of Commerces of Aguascalientes and León. We are delighted to have you here and talk about this, about the future of energy, and not only in the way we generate power or we transmit it, but also in the way we manage all this power or all this load, especially when you're bringing in new types of businesses, just like distributed generation or our charging stations for EVs, etc. So in that sense, I would like you to talk with us about what does INATBA does, what do you guys do, and how does it relate to energy, and what are the blockchain applications that you see in the energy and the business spectrum coming in?
Sure, Juan Manuel, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what INATBA is doing and what we see as some of the very interesting applications that are being deployed using blockchain technologies in relation to energy. INATBA is a trade association. We specialize, or we focus our efforts on creating interactions between public policy and the private sector. So working to bring together discussions with governments, government ministers, regulators and legislators, and the private sector, those companies who are building, deploying blockchain applications and innovating new business models. We operate in 35 countries. We're based out of Belgium. Brussels actually is our headquarters in Europe, but we have reach into North America, South America, clearly across all of the countries in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Therefore, we're very focused on the global applications, the global deployment of this technology. Specifically in relation to your question about the applications that we see that are particularly interesting, we see a lot of potential for energy distribution and peer-to-peer energy generation and distribution using smart contracts based around blockchain technologies. These are ways in which efficiency can be brought not just into, I guess, energy consumption, but also into the entire business model. So if you could imagine a situation whereby perhaps at an individual level, you have solar panels on the roof of your house, and maybe there are periods during the day where you are recovering energy from the sun and not able to consume all of the surplus that you might be generating or recovering. You might be interested in retransmitting some of that back to the grid, or even transmitting some of that to your neighbor's electric vehicle charge point if they wish to charge their vehicle. So we're seeing some very smart applications in this particular example, where the use of blockchain technologies together with smart contracts can not just allow these transactions to happen and be settled, to be paid between the different parties, but also to happen in a way which is both secure and efficient in terms of the transaction. That's quite interesting because the example I give is on a peer-to-peer basis. But if you can imagine that scaling up to some considerable number, say hundreds or thousands of properties, then you could imagine a situation whereby you could reduce some of the required load on grids from a distribution perspective, but also from a generation perspective. And you mentioned electric vehicles and charge points and other forms of vehicular travel, which are relying more and more on electricity. You could then imagine that some of these charge points that are being rolled out could begin to make use of not just innovative business models, but innovative ways of payment methods being secured. So it might well be that you're paying or trading energy between different parties rather than settling transactions in currency. And maybe what you're doing is you're swapping surplus energy from one generator to a demand where there might be a requirement from a neighbor for an electric vehicle to be charged, and vice versa. If the electric vehicle charge points don't have a requirement to charge vehicles because there are no vehicles pulling down on the network at that time, they could divert whatever supply they have access to or charge they might have in any battery storage to other participants in that smart grid network who had a requirement. And so you can imagine swapping energy between parties there. They're just a few of the initial applications off the top of my head. And clearly, as we talk about blockchain, we can focus on the consumption of energy to power blockchain-based solutions, whether it's mining applications to mine cryptocurrencies, or whether it's other blockchain protocols that are processing transactions, and how the increasing energy efficiency focus is allowing the innovators to come up with new ways of providing security of transactions, immutability of blockchains, whilst reducing the overall consumption of the energy that they require to power those transactions. So they're just two of the innovations that we're seeing at the moment.
Well, as you might know, we just joined in as a company, and we've seen this major advantage on using blockchain technology in all the transactions you do, not only in the energy industry, but in the business in general. But one of the main questions when you talk with someone on what you're doing, if you're working with blockchain, is the subject of regulation. Is this very legal? Our utility companies are comfortable with having distributed generation that operates with blockchain, and that they have this immutability. And as you just mentioned in the prior question, the way you can sell power to your neighbor that is charging his EV or whatever, and utilities don't like that much. And I think blockchain comes to disrupt the way we do business, as well as this matter on distributed generation. So my specific question is, what are the major regulation blockades that you see, or the major regulation challenges for the applications on blockchain in the energy industry?
Well, Juan Manuel, I think you just hit the nail on the head, to use a British phrase. You went right to the heart of the matter. Blockchain represents an opportunity for fundamental change, and change in business models, change in business processes, and maybe even changes in the structure of a market. And that sometimes can cause concern. So from a regulatory perspective, we see, largely speaking, two forms of regulation. One form is with a mind or with an eye towards the traditional architecture of industries and wanting to maintain that market stability, that infrastructure stability, because power generation and power distribution is a critical asset to all countries. And you don't want something which is so critical subjected to a huge disturbance, because it could cause issues for your country. So there are concerns from a regulatory perspective about not overtly disrupting the status quo and going on a gentle journey, making sure that the important distribution of electricity, the important distribution of power can be maintained so that critical infrastructure is not put at risk. And I'm talking about transport mechanisms, I'm talking about hospital facilities, healthcare, and all these vital components within countries. So the first piece of regulatory consideration is around market integrity. The second piece to consider is around the climate action, what I would call the renewables, or the circular economy. And regulators are very mindful that certain types of blockchain are historically they believe have not been tremendously energy efficient, or in the regulator's words, have consumed a lot of energy to create very little gain for society. So there is a view from regulators whereby they wish to ensure that blockchains that are being deployed on a massive scale are being deployed with an efficient consumption of energy. So to give you a classic example, they might be regarding Bitcoin mining as very high consumers of energy for little gain, whereas other types of blockchains that might require less proof of work and more proof of stake, i.e. consuming less energy to process transactions, might be regarded as more acceptable to regulators. So there are two considerations. One is about the market stability and not totally disrupting the market, but continuing to support innovation. The second is about considering the types of blockchain applications that are permitted to be developed at scale, such that there is true efficiency and not a situation being created whereby there is an overtly high consumption of energy for what they perceive as a relatively low return or gain for society.
That's very interesting what you just mentioned about the way regulators also see this this new technology being deployed in the energy industry, and how it also affects or could affect the network and or the grid, and that always gets the regulators a little bit scared on what's the next step on this. And there's a saying on that which states regulation is always 3 or 4 years behind technology. So basically, regulators are trying to cope with this new technology, with this blockchain technology. And just for a last question, because we have other panelists here, and I'm sure that they also want to jump in eventually on what we are just discussing now. How long do you think it's going to take to have this smart grid that we're talking about? I mean, a smart grid that has distributed generation, EV charging, a lot of renewables, but also all this works with blockchain technology, where you can do peer-to-peer trading, where you can also mine cryptos. I mean, all of this that we have discussed, and maybe technology is already in that regard, but regulation and the market maybe is not there yet. How long do you think it's going to take for the world to get into that point?
I still think we're quite a way off from reaching the position that you outlined. And the reason I say that is because regulators and generally public officers are still trying to learn about the technology. They're still trying to understand what blockchain is, how it functions. And that's a process they have to go through first, with assistance from organizations like INATBA and yourselves. But they can't build effective regulation until they reach a level of education about the potential of the technology and some of the possible risks of the technology as well. And then from there, they have to develop the regulations that would support the type of vision that you laid out. And often to develop those regulations can be a lengthy process. If we look at some of the regulation traveling through the European Parliament at the moment, it's probably a year and a half into its life cycle in relation to a piece of regulation called the Market in Crypto Assets, which is an approach towards defining how all tokens could be treated across the whole of Europe. And there's probably still another 18 months to 2 years of that process to continue. So we might be looking at a development period for this particular piece of regulation at somewhere between 2 to 3 years. And once the regulation is developed, you then have to have the market follow behind that regulation and operate within the regulatory parameters that have been provided to it, which could take another 1 to 2 years. So it wouldn't surprise me to see the type of vision that you've outlined being only reality within, say, minimum of a 5-year period, sadly.
As you just mentioned, sadly, it's gonna be almost 5 years to have this vision on what is gonna happen with with all this technology being employed as in the regular basis, as a common trade. So we'll keep on working with that, and we hope to shorten that timeline, that time frame, and bring it closer to the present. Mark, thanks again for being here. Thank you for joining us. And I know we have some issues with the timing, etc., but we're delighted to have you here. And on behalf of Coparmex Aguascalientes and Coparmex León, we want to thank you for being here. We'll send you a digital certification for your participation, a thank you note, let's say, for joining us. And we hope that this is one of more events to come, and that we can work closer with the INADVA and all the members of the INADVA deploying this network of blockchain applications throughout Mexico. Thanks again, Mark, and have a great day.
Thanks, Juan Manuel, and you too. And thank you very much for having me.